Thanks, everyone, for the really sort of provocative presentations. I guess I wanted to start with Bijoy, since he began the panel. I mean, when we spoke on the phone prior to the conference, we talked about how your practice goes beyond this idea of storytelling, or just the exchange between the architect and the artisan, to begin to open up the potentials of architecture. And you talked to me about how, to a lot of times, things that were proposed by the artisans would provoke a sense of discomfort in you, and that was a good gauge in terms of being able to open up the process or open up the project, and in a certain sense renounce your hand or renounce the idea of authorship. When does the idea of, how do you guide the process? How do you lead the process? What happens to the sense of leadership that the architect is one that ultimately controls things when you introduce these ideas of ambiguity or discomfort into the process?
Okay, to just set it up, someone has to drive the car.
Right.
And unfortunately, I'm the one driving the car. But that doesn't mean the other participants in the car are not influential in the way, the journey of, or the route that we take, which is not necessarily specific. All we know is we're going for a drive. But to be more specific in terms of this idea of discomfort, for me what's important really is that when it challenges my perception of how things should be. And so to elaborate on that, to be more specific maybe, and I think we spoke about in the particular to the Palmyra House project, where there's, the 4 columns on the corners are the ones really that take all the weight of the house, and the way they come and terminate. And they were very particular that the column should extend beyond the horizontal beam, which sort of floats above the ground. And this is something that I would naturally do, is actually cut that extension. And for a long time I pondered on that, sort of back and forth, but they were very clear. And again, it was the gesture in which they spoke about it, and the confidence in which they spoke about it, which I did not have, like the way they had. So I think it's important to also observe, at least for me, and I think likewise for them also, because I think from time to time these positions, change through the movement of the day as projects and as ideas get discussed in the studio. But what was more critical, I think, in that discussion was this sort of body gestures, and also the amount, there were not just one, but 2 or 3 different voices that seconded that position. And this idea that you need to listen to these voices and relinquish the position that I have, or actually challenge the perception of how I believe it should be.
How do you know when to relinquish that, though? Because the architectural training, right, is always one of...
I think it's important to give up the space that you're the one in control. Because again, what is it finally about? Is it about me as an architect, or the potential of what we collectively can do and put out there? Because eventually that's why I just sort of touched upon this idea of time, is where what we do has its own life form after we do what we do. And it takes its own position in space for participation from all kinds, whether it's climate, people, time, etc., etc., etc. But so I think it's at some point you have to recognize and let go that position.
So the project itself takes on a particular autonomy to begin to be generative itself.
I think that's why we're there to do that, and so that's the role of what we do. It's a profession that is in service, right? And it's a service in the way that we engage ourselves in a physical environment that has an impact on many things. I don't want to be specific to one or the other, but very broadly. And I think it's a certain position or place that we need to understand in the responsibilities that come with what we do. No different from a doctor or a lawyer, for that matter of fact, or a mathematician, or for that matter even a musician. So I think it's important to recognize the impact or the power that we carry with us, and how that has its own position in space.
Can I lead that into a question with Daniel? Because I think it becomes quite interesting. You talk about architecture as a profession that's sort of in service, or a service position. And yet Daniel's, I mean, to a certain extent, you could argue that the different platforms you're created are creating a service, but you can also argue that they're projects without a mandate, right? They're self-initiated projects. So, and also, you've also questioned the sort of decision-making authority of the architect in terms of the sort of open source or making a decision by the crowd. So how would you discuss your role as an architect in terms of leadership, and also how do you as an architect, through these different open sources, begin to generate an economy of exchange? I mean, how do you make what you're doing, to be honest with you, sort of profitable?
Well, answering to your first question about, well, let's think about the platforms itself. If they, or why we're doing that, why we're self-initiating, what is the position of the architect? I think we have to realize that since we have this 2% only, the market share, somehow when we talk to clients or other people, they don't really trust architects anymore in most cases.
Do you find that, Bijoy?
Yes and no.
Continue. Sorry, I'm just curious.
It's you know, if you go, like, many people don't see the why they should pay this extra money for an architect, because they don't see the value in what we're doing. Actually, they might not appreciate that anymore. And maybe it might have to do with society. It might have to do also part that is our faults. And that's, I think, where the architect has to take the position more as a moderator, either. So kind of like being within the system and moderating in between all the participants. Or he has to bring really kind of like a certain knowledge to the table, like you do, like developing certain knowledge with a certain material. But to be honest, like how a lot of the kind of like education has developed in recent years is that architects or students didn't have the knowledge anymore to do something, to build something, but they had the knowledge, okay, to imagine spaces in the kind of computer and drawings. But this kind of like translation mode was missing. And if you ask any architect, I mean, any client today will ask you to kind of like develop a sustainable building. When I ask students in the 4th, 5th year how much photovoltaics you actually need for a 3-person family in the north of Europe, no one can answer that. They just, the necessary knowledge that we need for doing these buildings, we don't teach that. So I think that's a point where when you come and you want to discuss with the client that the wall has to be inclined in this degrees, and then he asks you why, and you say it has to be like this because, you know, I'm the kind of like artistic author of this. I think then we can't give anything to our clients. We can't give anything to the investor, to anyone. And
is part of what you're saying is either because of the changing conditions of the architectural education, that in a certain sense the architects themselves don't have the knowledge or expertise to be able to practice in the same ways?
I think partly yes.
I'm slightly different in the firstly, I think it's not about architecture or architects. I think humans are skeptics to begin with about everything and anything. So that's just the human condition. But how do you overcome the skepticism, I think, is what is more important to talk about than the skepticism itself. And it's the effort or the endeavor that you go through. And it's a process of learning. There's no way we can know everything. It's just physically not possible. And then we acquire the position of, you know, God in that sense.
Right.
And the same goes with a doctor, and I'm intentionally using other professions as a gauge to understand how we can participate. And I think the participation comes in making the effort and going the distance and having the tenacity and the conviction in the idea that has been very clearly demonstrated also in the earlier session. You know, it's a difficult journey. It's not one that is easy, and you're going to be faced with resistance. But it's the resistance that is offered that sort of it's necessary, because that provides a new opportunity. And I think the difficulty is that we want everything without resistance. you know, that's the easy way, and that doesn't then, because it's and that's what I was trying to do, the gesture of space. It's opening, you know, through the idea of a gesture, and it's the obstructions that are provided, and it's negotiating the obstructions that are built along the way that actually open up a possible creativity. It's a position of taking away the status quo. Okay, so that's my view of looking at it.
Yeah, how would you react to that, Greta? How would you react to these sort of...
Well, I think the role of the architect is very different from where you are in the world. So I think, for instance, I feel more... I think that in Norway, we are losing ground. I think it was different 50 years ago. And I think it's also partly our own fault, because we tend to not wanting to do project leadership and administration and all these a bit kind of boring things, and then other profession has taken over, and that is part of the problem. And I think also what you said about the education, perhaps, well, at least in Norway, I think when I talk about this, the ability of the individual, what traits is necessary, and then there is this kind of, you have to have a competence as a base, but you also have to have a kind of understanding of the neighboring professions.
Do you...
and how do we go about that? I think perhaps you have to specialize also in the architect, more specialize, so that you have kind of architects that are more into, for instance, statics, and others that are more into urbanism, more than we do today. That's one way of solving it, I think. Yeah.
I think you make a good point, and like we're saying that over the years we gave a lot of responsibilities away. It started with kind of not many architects want to do the structure anymore, calculation, so we give it away, you know. And over the time nowadays, you can go to Arup or any big engineering company, they can build your house. They don't need you anymore, basically. Yeah, I mean, we're sitting in a building where probably there was no architect involved in this. Yeah, we consider this a beautiful building. Yeah, but it's kind of based on kind of decisions that were made purely on function of that building. So, in a way, the position that we are in now, and again, it might be different in different parts of the world, but especially we have to consider also that 30% of the cities are informal cities. They're just built by people. And the question is, how we find our position in this kind of new economies, I would say, or maybe ecologies, you can call it. Because, for instance, in Europe, in Italy, we have the highest density of architects. But most of them are unemployed because there's no construction going on. If you really consider that our world population will rise to 9 billion in 2050, plus we have an immense increase in cities all over the world, I mean, there shouldn't be any architect in the world jobless, because there is a lot of work. But in a way, we cannot bring something to the table that really people need our services, because in most of the countries where architects have jobs is because it's by regulation, because you need an architect, right? In Germany, you need by regulation architect if you want to do building. If you don't need it, I think in a lot of countries, or also in Germany, maybe a lot of buildings will be done without.
You're shaking your head.
No, I completely disagree.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Absolutely. Because I think this notion of freedom without responsibility is something that needs to be considered. Freedom comes with responsibility.
What do you mean freedom?
Freedom in terms of what we, as the role of an architect, to be able to think, come up with an idea, develop it, etc., etc. And I'm saying that the responsibility also has to be one of economic one. And that's what we've relinquished, I believe, you know, and I'm saying this because I purposely put myself in positions where I also have to take economic responsibility for something that I do that has a direct impact on the project where it doesn't work. And that has a direct impact on me. What it has done for me, though, has trained me and provided a discipline of being that much more precise in the action that I take.
I have a few more questions, but we said because this is a panel about exchange that we would open it up to the audience for the last 5 minutes. Does anyone have any questions or challenges to what's been said? No? One.
Yes, I have a question to Daniel, which is quite simply, what did your project lead to? Because by the time that you had finished your Open Japan, which was the last project that you showed, it was really about making not Japanese people who were hit by the tsunami smile, but all the architects around the world who got to use this amazing technological infrastructure that you'd created. So what did it actually lead to in terms of on-the-ground improvements?
No, I mean, my mic working, yeah? The quotation that I showed were also from the people in Japan, actually. That was kind of very surprising that the people that we worked with, it made them really feel that they are not alone and other people want to work with them on a not profit base. Yeah? Because that was kind of like, there's no project at the end that would go to the people that are involved in there or something. All the things that was developed is accessible for everyone. Everyone can just take it. Considering this very difficult political situation in Japan now, what we're having is that we now actually working with NGOs and also people who have a lot of experience in post-disaster reconstruction that are now trying to look through the project and trying to talk with organizations in Japan how we can implement this. But if you looked at the diagram, that was also very important for us. There was no ideas that we developed outside of the country, but there was always a problem definition that came from the country, from people that were involved. So, like the whole process, I mean, basically we learned from the design thinking process that we, don't start that we have an idea, but there was always a problem definition that started. And there was a long discussion, and that's why we changed at the last moment as well. The strategy for the project was not about developing one project and carrying it through, but this was also through the kind of discussions with our Japanese partners. They would be much better in terms of politics to create this kind of like big cloud of 99 ideas and not being critical with anyone or not trying to really oppose a certain idea on the population. So you have to really see that if that project would have happened in any other country, in India or in China or in Europe, we would have developed it different. But the Japanese kind of culture of not really wanting to take help is a very difficult one that we had to accept.
Anyone else? Teddy? Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, no, I was just going to, I think it's a good debate, and in fact it helps me to clarify something that might be, I don't know, in the audience's mind, because whenever we talk, let's say, for example, about Doina and Konstantin's project that they presented earlier that relies on the kind of scale, on the kind of activism, you would imagine that it might be about letting people do whatever they want and that there is no driver on the car, but there is a kind of choreography that happens where the architect begins to anticipate, begins to design the kind of interface, the kind of mechanism that enables those relations. It's not to say that it's just to let it for everybody to just do whatever they want. I mean, there is something equally as self-assured as when we want to design a building in such a deterministic way. So I think that it is, I don't know how to say it, but it helps me to articulate that we are trying to enable mechanisms that intensify and anticipate social encounter, civic encounter. And I think in that sense, it's a more, I don't want to say it's a weak position, but a position nevertheless. And I think that I'm thinking, because usually when we speak of our work, since it is not dominated by buildings with capital A architecture, it's suggesting that we are relinquishing our specialization or disciplinarity. It's not, it's just approaching it from a kind of tangential point of view, I think, which is an important aspect.
Great. Okay. I think on that note, I'd like to say thank you to everybody and to the panelists and the organizers of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.